The Falcons are taking a brand new philosophy to coverage, and will it enlighten them on their path to the playoffs?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. And if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. But I've been going so strong here on this podcast for almost 9 years, and I appreciate each and every one of you that has been going strong with me as an everydayer. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day, and all you got to do to become an everydayer, subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we are continuing our look at each position group ahead of training camp, talking about the secondary, why we're excited about the additions at the safety position, how will the dust settle at the various competitions at cornerback. But our big question of the day is, have the Falcons actually upgraded their secondary? That remains to be seen. We'll circle back and see if we find an answer to that question by the end of today's episode. But you know, one of the things that the Falcons have done, regardless of where you stand on that question, is they're going to have a brand new philosophy when it comes to how they approach defense and particularly coverage, right? New defensive coordinator Jeff Ulbrich, he's talked about wanting to simplify. And simplify often means, hey, more man coverage. He's going to be a lot more aggressive in how he approaches. Now, the Falcons are still going to be primarily a zone team like most NFL defenses, but in select situations, they are almost certainly going to ratchet up how much man coverage they play. When you look at the Falcons compared to the Jets last year, and I only charted 5 games as a part of a film breakdown, almost 2 hours, that dropped yesterday for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. You can hit the link in the description below if you want to check that out for free, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. After that point, if you want to continue being an insider. But, you know, I charted 5 games of the Jets defense last year, and compared that with how the Falcons played last year. And basically, based off of those 5 games, and again, not the entire season, but the Jets basically played man coverage almost twice the rate of the Falcons in certain situations. First downs, third downs, red zone, right? Key sort of situations. And we saw the Falcons trending towards increasing their man coverage in the latter half of last season, and there's no reason to think that that trend won't continue with the hiring of Jeff Ulbrich as the Falcons' new defensive coordinator. It's just going to be a question of how much do they lean on that man coverage. Now, you know, this is a change in philosophy because the Falcons have been a bend but don't break defense so far under Raheem Morris, and that philosophy makes sense. It's basically the idea, you know, at least logically, in theory, it's the idea like we're going to be willing to concede 5 yards so that you don't get the chunk yards, right? It's like, we'll give you 5 yards so that you don't take 25 yards is basically the idea of that. And it's the idea that eventually offenses will mess up, you know, whether that's on third downs or in the red zone. You know, most years your number one third down offense in the league converts less than half of their third downs. And so in theory, you know, again, stressing the word theory, the advantage will shift to a defense once you can get them to a second, third down on any given series. Now, I do think there's flaws in the bend but don't break philosophy. You know, I think it mostly works when you've had a high-powered offense. It's the idea of like, okay, well, we're going to concede field goals, but we're going to score touchdowns, and that's a formula that can win games. And when you look at the Brandon Staley's and the Raheem Morris's and their success running those schemes in LA, you know, they had Sean McVay on the opposite, you know, side of the ball calling plays, and it's a lot easier to make that work when you have who I think is the best head coach in football and one of the best play callers in football. And as much as we love Zach Robinson, you know, I don't know if he's going to be Sean McVay, but shout out to Zach Robinson and all the things that he's going to do this upcoming season. Okay, but I think the other element that makes that philosophy, particularly nowadays in today's NFL, more so than it was 5 years ago, is, these new kickoff rules mean that field position is much harder to control for a defense, right? With now the kickoff setting touchbacks starting at the 35, it's like you just need like 3 first downs and you're in field goal range. When the touchback started at the 20, like you would have to go, potentially 5 first downs. And, those 2 different first downs make a big difference when you're basically so willing to concede yards. And so I do think going to much more of an aggressive man coverage philosophy for this team is a welcome change. But it doesn't mean that it solves all the Falcons' problems. Man coverage also has its pros and cons. It's kind of a live by the sword, die by the sword philosophy. I mean, Falcon fans are very familiar with that, dying by the sword, because you go back to the Super Bowl with all the man coverage they were playing in that game. That was a contributing factor to how and why the Falcons choked in that game. And ultimately, when you're going to play man coverage to a significant degree, it boils down to how you match up. And that's going to be a big question for this team at cornerback, right? Now, the Falcons are betting on their pass rush to take some of the pressure off of their cornerbacks and their ability to match up. And I know that's a crazy thing to say in the year of our Lord 2025, that here on Locked On Falcons, we're talking about the Atlanta Falcons. Yes, those Atlanta Falcons are betting on their pass rush to carry their defense. It's, why we can sit here and say that maybe the world is indeed on the verge of ending. I feel like this was a passage in the book of Revelations about something related to the Falcons pass rush being good, being one of the signs of the apocalypse. But we will see on that. But as we discussed on yesterday's podcast, there's absolutely a path that this Falcons pass rush, that this might be one of the best pass rushes that this team has had in literal decades this upcoming season. And if you want to hear why that is, go check out yesterday's episode of Locked On Falcons. And if they are, that's going to ease a lot of the pressure on the secondary, particularly at cornerback. And we saw that, that's going to be something that's needed, because anytime the Falcons faced a offense that had more than one good wide receiver last year, it seemed like this secondary really struggled, or at least the defense really struggled, right? I'm looking at the Seahawks games, the Vikings game, and that first Tampa Bay game. If we dodged the bullet with AJ Brown missing that week 2 game, because it's almost certainly, if he was healthy for that game, the Falcons would have started season 0-3. But like, that's potentially an issue if that issue hasn't solved itself, and the Falcons still struggle against teams that have multiple good wide receivers. That's an issue that could potentially rear its ugly head when you look ahead to who and what they're facing on this year's schedule. So, the Jets were able to get away with that because they, for the last 3 years, arguably had the best cornerback duo in the NFL in Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed. The Falcons, when Ulbrich was here previously, had a similar sort of philosophy, relying a lot on man coverage, particularly on third downs and in the red zone, when they had arguably one of the best cornerback duos in the league at that time, from like 2016 to 2018, when it was Robert Alford and Desmond Trufant. And the question is going to be, are Mike Hughes and AJ Terrell capable of being something along those lines, something similar, pulling that off? And so, we'll talk about that, as well as, whether or not the Falcons are going to get that type of play out of the nickel cornerback as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. So as I sit here recording a few hours on Monday night before the home run derby, I'm sure some of you are like, it's too late for me to go, but you can open up your Game Time app and see those prices tick down, because on Game Time, they got those killer last minute deals, and you can save up to 60% as you watch those prices drop the closer you get to that home run derby at 8 p.m. Eastern. Or you can wait till Tuesday and see, hey, there's going to be an opportunity for me to get tickets at the All-Star game for bargain basement prices. And that's what you get with Game Time, right? And you don't have to worry about scrolling through thousands of tickets, right? Because they have the zone deals that are going to pick the best seats in the section for you. Their panoramic seat views give you what you see is what you get, no hidden fees. Game Time guarantee is also going to have your back if you have to cancel last minute. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So we know that the Falcons' 2 starting outside cornerbacks are going to be AJ Terrell, Mike Hughes, and leaning on more man coverage should, in theory, and a lot of theoretical things going on today's episode, but in theory should benefit both of those guys, because when the Falcons started letting those guys play a little bit more press man coverage, particularly after the bye week last year, both responded very well based off of my charting of the Falcons defense. After the bye week, Mike Hughes in man coverage only gave up 3 catches on 8 targets. AJ Terrell only gave up 4 catches on 14 targets. And both guys had multiple pass breakups in that situation. And hopefully you will see that level of play continue into 2025. I think we've seen enough of AJ Terrell over the past 5 years to trust that he'll be fine in this new defensive philosophy, and basically the only concerns we have with AJ Terrell is, if a big physical wide receiver like Mike Evans lines up across from him, and there's going to be a couple of those matchups this year where, AJ's a little bit more up and down than usual, but we're going to sleep fine outside of a handful of games with him manning one of those spots. But, there's absolutely a world with this more aggressive approach on the back end that that AJ Terrell is going to have maybe one of the best years that he's had in quite some time, right? That we haven't really seen that peak AJ Terrell since that 2021 season, and maybe 2025 is going to be another one of those peak years. Now, when you look across from him at Mike Hughes, he's a much bigger question mark. And will we see what he was able to show in that final month of 2024 carry over into 2025? Or will he maybe fall back down a little bit to earth and he just kind of went on a run for 4 or 5 games last year? And then, in a world where we're imagining AJ Terrell having a great year again, how does that impact Mike Hughes? Like, for example, in New York, DJ Reed was the CB2 there. And it was getting a lot of targets playing opposite Sauce Gardner, where quarterbacks and offenses were like, okay, we'll just avoid Sauce and we'll throw at DJ. And DJ held up really well. That's why many people considered him to be the best CB2 in the NFL over the last 3 years. And if that happens in Atlanta, will Mike Hughes hold up in a similar way? Now, we don't need Mike Hughes to be all world, but if we can get consistently, say, like B- play from him, I think that will go a long way to, improving this new look defense and defensive philosophy. And then when we talk beyond the outside cornerback, you have questions at the nickel cornerback position, right? Where you're going to have potentially a 3-way competition for that starting spot between D. Alford, Clark Phillips, and Billy Bowman. This is not new. I was thinking about it earlier today that it feels like over the past 20 years, about 60% of the time, the Falcons are having a quote-unquote open competition at that nickel cornerback position. It has been somewhat of a revolving door for many, many years over the last 2 decades. And it's part of the reason why I think some of us, myself included, kind of look back with nostalgia at those 3 years where Brian Poole kind of stabilized that spot in the 2016 through 2018 seasons previously under the Dan Quinn regime. Now, when we talk about D. Alford, we know he's coming off a very rough season. I know most of my audience has no confidence in him moving forward should he wind up winning that starting competition at nickel. I'm not going to sit here and try to waste time trying to convince you otherwise, but I do think he could, in theory, benefit from playing in a more man-heavy scheme, since you could argue his best work to date in Atlanta was in that 2023 season when Ryan Nielsen was all about playing man coverage as much as humanly possible. And what's funny to me about D. Alford and all the negativity surrounding him as we sit here today, D. Alford is arguably or absolutely kind of a success story, relatively speaking, right? As an undrafted free agent that came down from the CFL, and we saw basically 1.5 fairly solid years of nickel cornerback play from him in 22 and 23, giving the team the most stability they've had at that position since Brian Poole. You can say objectively that D. Alford would be a hit for Terry Fontenot in the Falcons as far as an addition goes, but that's certainly not going to give you any solace if he's getting cooked by Jalen Waddle and Josh Downs this season, like he was getting cooked by various wide receivers last season. Now, when we talk about Clark Phillips, we'll see what he does as he gets his first real earnest shot at winning the nickel cornerback position. And a large reason why he hasn't gotten an opportunity up to this point is because D. Alford has been kind of holding that spot down until he wasn't. And, when we drafted Clark Phillips back in 2023, I was of the opinion that if there's the only path for him being a plus starter in the NFL would be as a nickel slot corner. And, here we are. 2 years later, the Falcons' prophet has struck again. But, for that reason, I kind of see this summer as kind of a make or break summer for Clark Phillips, right? That if he can't win the nickel spot this year with, D. Alford hitting rock bottom and, beating out a rookie safety in Billy Bowman, who we're going to talk about in a second, he's probably never going to win a starting spot ever in the NFL and will just always be a solid backup, which again, there's value to that. But, ultimately long-term, if you're not going to be a contributor on special teams, then that's only going to go so far as your NFL career goes. But we'll see what Clark Phillips can do. Not giving up on Clark Phillips, but we'll see what he winds up being. Now, that also leaves Billy Bowman, the Falcons' 4th round selection in this past year's draft. And I think many of us are hopeful that he's going to wind up being the guy that wins that starting nickel slot corner spot. I'm not necessarily as high on Billy Bowman as maybe some other people are, including Jarvis Davis of Locked On Sports Atlanta. In a lot of ways, the reason for that is he kind of reminds me of Clark Phillips as being another sort of undersized guy that I think is going to struggle to match up in the NFL. But I think 2 things that Billy Bowman has going for him that Clark Phillips didn't necessarily have coming into the NFL was that Billy Bowman has 4.4 speed instead of 4.5 speed like Clark Phillips did. And I think Bowman has a much more physical disposition and demeanor, right? Which I think is very necessary to have as a nickel cornerback, particularly in this scheme where you're going to be a significant part of the run fits moving forward. So when it comes to roster projection, I'm going to count Billy Bowman as like a 5th safety, even though he might wind up winning that starting nickel cornerback spot and playing, all of his snaps as a cornerback. But when we're looking at projecting how these various competitions are going to go for the Falcons, I expect them to keep at least 5 corners. It's possible that they could keep 6. We know Terrell and Hughes are going to be 2 of your 5. Between Alford and Phillips, they're going to keep at least 1. And I think Phillips probably, given his ability to provide depth on the outside, is probably the favorite to beat out Alford. To me, Alford kind of has to win the starting nickel cornerback spot, or he probably winds up getting cut. So that means at least between those 4 guys, you're going to keep 3 of them. You've had the Falcons also signing Mike Ford to play special teams. And I think that's going to make him a virtual lock to make the roster. I don't necessarily expect anybody to usurp him because I feel like that was a Marquise Williams, the Falcons special teams coordinator's driven signing this past offseason. And so if that means that Mike Ford makes 4, now you kind of have everybody else kind of competing for 1 spot, right? And the guys that are the primary competition there, Natron Brooks, Kobe Bryant, Keith Taylor, potentially Kevin King. It's no offense to Lamar Jackson, the other Lamar Jackson that plays corner, and Dante Manning, another undrafted free agent. But I'm more expecting those guys to compete for a practice squad spot than a roster spot. But Kobe Bryant is the guy that's getting a lot of buzz as the team's signature undrafted free agent out of Kansas. I'm a little more skeptical than others, although I did once upon a time consider myself to be a big Kobe Bryant fan. And then the Falcons signed him after the draft. And then all the people that were now calling themselves Kobe Bryant fans were saying things like, oh, he's going to wind up being the starter opposite AJ Terrell by the end of this season. And I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can qualify as a fan anymore because some of y'all started moving the goalposts on a little bit tad further than what I'm comfortable with when it comes to talking up Kobe Bryant. But I'm very eager to see if he winds up living up to that type of hype with a strong training camp this summer after, tearing it up at the Shrine Bowl back in, January of last year in terms of the last time we got to see him play football. So, we'll see what Kobe Bryant does. I'm a fan of Natron Brooks. I think he's the most physical DB on this team other than DeMarcco Hellams. He also is a valuable special teams guy, so that always boosts your stock for making a back-end roster spot. He also has experience playing both inside and outside at cornerback position. And it's kind of a similar conversation we had last week, I believe, when we were talking about the wide receiver position, when we were talking about Nick Nash, another high-profile undrafted free agent making the team. And I basically said, like, yeah, the player that you want Nick Nash to be is already on the team. His name is Kadero Hodge. And I kind of feel like Natron Brooks is already kind of what you're hoping Kobe Bryant's going to be. But I know people have higher expectations than being a, inside outside backup special teams player than Kobe Bryant. As I said, other people seem to think that he's going to be a long-term starter here in Atlanta. So we'll see if he lives up to that hype. But, Keith Taylor is another guy that I would love to see come in training camp and ball out, just because the Falcons could certainly use some size in that cornerback room where, it's overpopulated with short kings and undersized guys with T-Rex arms. And getting a guy with, Taylor's length and size would be beneficial. So I think there's going to be plenty of competition at the cornerback position, not only at that nickel for that starting spot, but also who's going to carve out these last few roster spots on the back end of the cornerback depth chart. And we'll see who emerges not only in camp, but in the preseason. And then we'll see if, who plays and performs well during the regular season, and whether or not we're considering cornerback to be a strength of this team. And we'll be saying, oh, they did indeed upgrade this position, or we'll be like, well, they need to upgrade this position, and we'll go back, or the people that have been pining for the last 3 years for the Falcons to use their top selection on a cornerback in the draft will be going right back to that wheelhouse next offseason when the Falcons are picking in round 2, because they don't have a first round pick. So we have plenty of questions at the cornerback position. I think we have less questions at the safety position, but a big one will be who's going to start opposite Jessie Bates. So while I wonder if the Falcons have upgraded their cornerback position, and will a man-heavy scheme sort of expose some concerns at that spot, I don't have those same questions at the safety position, because I do feel like this is a much better safety room than they had last year. And that's not meant to be a shot at Justin Simmons, who was the team's second safety beside Jessie Bates last year. And I thought Simmons was fine. He didn't live up to the hype. I think you could argue, and maybe I'm being generous when I say this, but certainly that's the point of argument. You can go back and forth on it, that you could argue that Justin Simmons gave you B- play last year, all things considered. I just think the problem was that people were expecting A+ play from Justin Simmons, and the B- is disappointing when you were expecting an A+. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced that any one individual in this safety room, besides obviously Jessie Bates, is going to give you significantly better than B- play this upcoming season. But I am somewhat confident in this depth of the safety position that the sum of the parts will add up to more than sort of B- play, right? That, particularly with the improved depth, because it was very clear that, this regime did not have any confidence in Richie Grant last year, who was the third safety behind Bates and Simmons last year. That once DeMarcco Hellams went down with that injury, it had the team kind of scrambling to sign Simmons, and hopefully Hellams is going to be back, healthy this year. You also add Xavier Watts in round 3. You sign Jordan Fuller, who's been a mostly solid veteran starter throughout his NFL career. And so again, even if not an individual one of those players gives you a B-, I think they have a nice mix of skill sets that the sum of their parts, if deployed correctly, can give you more than B- play collectively. And so when you look at that skill sets, Hellams is that physical box safety, and you need that type of physicality in this scheme, given that, the scheme can be a little vulnerable to teams that are committed to running up the middle, and you need your DBs to be willing to stick their nose in there against the run. Fuller is probably your best all-around guy, good enough against the run, good enough in coverage, not elite in either, but he has the smarts and toughness to kind of overcome his athletic limitations. And then, of course, we have the X factor, which is Xavier Watts, who has the potential to be very good in coverage. And so if anybody is going to be that sort of B+ or higher safety next to Jessie Bates, I would bet on Xavier Watts, manning the deep middle of the field when the Falcons play their man coverage, as well as, being in those split safety looks, as we know that the Jets love their cover 4 under Ulbrich and Saleh. And I think we'll see a significant increase in that quarters looks for this Falcons defense this year. And we know that Watts was a very productive ball hawk in college. He has the neck up ability that you constantly hear me talk about when it comes to the safety position, which is the most important factor. So we'll see on that. And so, and then on cherry on top of that, you got Jessie Bates. And speaking of our favorite non-monogamous safety, and we fully support we are fully anti-monogamy on this podcast. And I should explain for those of you that are new to the pod and don't understand all the weird references that we make on the podcast, congratulations for making it this far into the episode and sticking with us. So maybe you're on the path to being an everydayer. But we call Jessie Bates a cheater on this podcast. It's been a running gag since 2023. And I know the worst thing that the easiest way you can make something unfunny is explaining the joke. But want to make that clear for those of you that, if you're going to be an everydayer here, you got to at least follow the sense of humor, as corny as it is. But Jessie Bates has a tendency to freelance in coverage. And due to that neck up ability, he's so smart that he can kind of get into a quarterback's mind and teleport across the field where the quarterback is reading the coverage and think Jessie's in one place, and then he teleports, snagging an interception, and the quarterback's like, he's not supposed to be there. And then Jessie's like, well, I'm supposed to be loyal to one woman, but I'm not. So that's why we call Jessie Bates a cheater, right? And with Xavier Watts, he's got that enabler to allow him to step out on his girl so often this upcoming season, if you understand the metaphor. So I'm expecting Xavier Watts to snatch that second safety spot, and I think it'll be a battle between Hellams and Fuller for that third safety spot. I think, it'd be easy to assume that because Fuller has starting experience, was a free agent addition, that he'd be the front runner there. But I do think Hellams has a unique skill set that I think could be very valuable to this team, particularly again as a run defender, because the Jets rarely played dime when they played, three safeties and three corners, but they did play a lot of big nickel, which is three safeties and two corners. And they like to deploy that, especially against teams that used a lot of two tight end sets. And we'll see a healthy amount of those teams this upcoming season. But, I think you really need a guy that can help be a physical run defender in that third safety role, given how the Falcons and or Jets have played in the past. And so we also have to remind ourselves that Hellams, seemed set to start for this team last year. We didn't realize it at the time, but in hindsight kind of tells us that Hellams was on the path to beating out Richie Grant for that starting spot last year and played next to Bates. And then he got hurt in the first preseason game, and then Simmons was brought in. And, that speaks to the team having, probably a lot of confidence in him. And we'll ultimately have to see how the hierarchy at safety and the dust settles at that position this summer. But, I think we know that the Falcons have one of the best safeties in the entire NFL in Jessie Bates. And then I think they have three solid role players. I think the sum of their parts is going to add up to having a very strong safety room. And then we got to mention Kevin King as well to close this thing out, because he was reportedly getting some of the starting reps at safety in OTAs. And we'll see if he's in the mix there. I appreciate Kevin King for trying to make his NFL comeback last year with the Falcons. I wish the Falcons had been like, okay, Kevin, thanks for your service. You can move on. I know PFF had him as the highest graded defender on the Falcons team last year, which, I've said it many times before. I think PFF is spot on 80% of the time, but I feel like that grade, is part of the 20% where I don't know what they're looking at. Because my charting basically had him as the worst guy in Falcons coverage last year, besides Antonio Hamilton. Shout out to Antonio Hamilton, who had that very bad day against Mike Evans. But Kevin King, based on my charting, was like almost 4 times as likely to give up an explosive play than literally anybody else on the Falcons defense. But he did have 2 pass breakups against the Raiders. So he did have a couple of positive moments last year, but that was about it. So we'll see if Kevin King is, we're sitting here second week of training camp and Kevin King is taking starting reps at safety. And people wonder why I'm a so-called Falcons hater, because they do stuff like this. It's like, what are we doing here, guys? What are we doing? But, I think back whenever I think back, think about the idea of Kevin King starting for this team or having a significant role for this team. I just got to think back to that one Falcon fan that was like, after the Falcons paid AJ Terrell last year, they was like, well, Kevin King's better than AJ Terrell. Why are we paying AJ Terrell? And so people want to know why I'm so jaded. It's because I've been dealing with that nonsense for 20 plus years. Who needs Julio Jones when we have Frank Darby, right? The things, Falcon fans say the wildest things, right? Kids say the darndest things. Falcon fans are known to say the wildest things. So that's what I'm dealing with. But we will keep it rolling here on the pod, talking more positions. Tomorrow we'll be talking about linebacker. We talked about the front end yesterday. We talked about the back end today. Linebackers are marrying it together. So we'll get into all of that on tomorrow's episode. Make sure you continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen by subscribing and following for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out Locked On Hawks. Check out Locked On MLB if you want to get the scoop. If you're not going to hit up Game Time to head on to the Home Run Derby, I'm sure Locked On MLB will have you covered for all of that, as well as Locked On NFL Scouting with Joe Marino, Kyle Krabs, making you the most informed fans you can possibly be all summer long. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.